Stop scrolling right now because this story is not fiction. This humiliation was real, and if you think money protects you, think again. Smash the subscribe button right now because what happened next could happen to you, your mother, or your wife. And stay till the very end because karma arrives in a way no one expected. They laughed at her, they grabbed her, they tried to drag her out like she was nothing, and the worst part is they did it inside the building her husband owned. My name is Camila Rodriguez, and on the day I walked into the Grand Meridian Hotel wearing simple clothes, I had no idea I was about to experience the most degrading moment of my life, a moment that would expose how cruel people can be when they think you have no power, no money, and no name. The Grand Meridian was not just another hotel to me, it was a dream built brick by my husband, Adrian Rodriguez, a man the world knew as a billionaire hotelier, but the man I knew as the boy who once borrowed money for coffee because he believed someday we would own places like this. I wanted to surprise him that morning. No cameras, no assistants, no luxury car, just me walking in like a regular guest because I missed him, because success had taken so much of his time and I wanted one quiet moment together. I wore light blue jeans, a plain white blouse, flat shoes, my hair tied loosely, no makeup, no jewelry, because I believed love did not need labels and respect should not depend on appearance. The moment I entered the lobby, the air felt heavy, polished marble floors, crystal chandeliers, staff moving with rehearsed smiles, soft piano music floating like a lie, because beneath all that beauty something ugly was waiting for me. I walked confidently toward the reception desk, smiling the way I always did when I felt at home, but that smile slowly died when the receptionist looked at me. Her name tag said Jessica, and her eyes scanned me from head to toe, not once but twice, as if she was searching for something expensive to justify my presence. Her lips curled slightly, and she asked, "Can I help you?" in a tone that already said, "You do not belong here." I replied calmly, "Yes, I have a reservation under Rodriguez." She began typing aggressively, her nails clicking loudly. Then she frowned, leaned closer to the screen, and said, "There is no reservation under that name." I felt confused, but not worried because Adrian often booked under his account, so I said gently, "It might be under Adrian Rodriguez." The moment I said that, her expression changed into something cruel. She laughed openly, not nervously, not politely, but mockingly, drawing attention from guests around us, and said, "Mum, this hotel does not entertain fantasies or people pretending to know the owner." I felt heat rise to my face, but I stayed composed because I believed misunderstanding could be resolved with kindness. I told her quietly, "I am his wife. I am here to surprise him." Her chair scraped loudly as she leaned back, crossing her arms. "Wife," she repeated loudly, then said, "Listen carefully. This is a luxury establishment, not a shelter, and we do not allow people like you to loiter." People like you. Those words cut deeper than she could imagine. Whispers started, phones subtly lifted. I felt exposed, naked, without protection, but before I could respond, she raised her voice and called security. Within seconds, two guards approached, tall, broad-shouldered, faces blank as stone. One of them said, "Mom, you need to leave immediately." I asked why, my voice shaking for the first time, and Jessica answered, "Because you are disturbing our guests and lying about knowing Mr. Rodriguez." That was when another woman appeared, heels clicking sharply, confidence dripping from every step. Her name was Patricia, the hotel manager. She did not ask me my name. She did not ask for ID. She did not check records. She simply looked at me and said, "What is the issue?" Jessica replied loudly, "She is a homeless woman pretending to be the owner's wife." Patricia sighed as if annoyed by my existence and said, "Remove her now. We cannot allow people like this to damage our image." And then it happened. One guard grabbed my arm tightly, pain shooting through my wrist as he began pulling me toward the exit. I gasped, trying to steady myself, saying, "Please wait, you are making a mistake." But my words were drowned by judgment and laughter. Guests watched, some amused, some uncomfortable. None intervened, and in that moment I realized how invisible dignity becomes when people believe you're poor. Every step toward the door felt heavier than the last. My heart pounded, not from fear but from disbelief that inside the empire my husband built I was being treated worse than dirt. And just as the glass doors came into view, just as humiliation reached its peak, a familiar voice thundered across the lobby, loud enough to silence everything. "What the hell is going on here?" The entire lobby froze as that voice echoed against the marble walls, sharp, Commanding, filled with authority that no one could ignore. The guards gripping my arms stiffened. Patricia turned pale. Jessica's mouth fell open, and slowly I turned my head, my heart pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. Standing just inside the entrance was Adrian Rodriguez, my husband, the man whose name was engraved on the very walls around us. His tailored suit fit perfectly, his presence commanding, yet the look on his face was something I had never seen before. Pure fury. His eyes locked onto me first, not the guards, not the staff, but me, and in that second his expression shifted from confusion to shock to rage. He strode forward, every step heavy, deliberate, the room parting for him like a sea. He stopped inches away from the guard holding me and said in a low, deadly calm voice, "Take your hands off my wife now." The guard released me, instantly stumbling backward. Patricia stuttered, "Mr. Rodriguez, we thought she was causing trouble." Adrian didn't look at her. Instead, he gently took my trembling hands into his voice soft only for me. "Camila, are you okay?" And I tried to smile, but my eyes burned, my throat tight, and that was all he needed. He turned slowly, surveying the lobby, the staff, the guests, the phones recording everything, and said loudly enough for everyone to hear, "This woman is my wife and the co-owner of this hotel." And the silence that followed was suffocating. Jessica's face drained of color. Patricia's knees nearly buckled. Adrian continued, his voice shaking with controlled anger. "Every single person who disrespected her today, every person who touched her, mocked her, or judged her based on her appearance, you are done here, effective immediately. You are fired. Security, escort them out. Not my wife, the guards, Jessica, Patricia, all of them." Patricia tried to speak, to apologize, to explain, but Adrian cut her off sharply. "You did not just disrespect my wife, you violated the core values of this company. We do not serve wealth, we serve people. And today you failed." He looked at the guests and said, "If any of you were treated the way my wife was treated today, I apologize personally. This will never happen again." And that promise would soon change everything, because the videos recorded that day spread like wildfire across social media. Millions watched my humiliation, millions saw Adrian's reaction, and millions began sharing their own stories of being judged, mistreated, and silenced. And as I stood there holding my husband's hand, surrounded by the wreckage of arrogance and cruelty, I realized something powerful. My pain was not just mine anymore, and that realization would become the beginning of something far bigger than a hotel, far bigger than wealth, something that would shake an entire industry. Before you think this was just a happy ending, listen carefully, because this is where the real nightmare began. Smash the subscribe button right now, because what happened after the cameras turned on will shock you even more. And remember, this could happen to you if you ever walk into the wrong place looking ordinary. So stay till the end, because power exposed is never as clean as it looks. After Adrian publicly defended me and fired everyone involved, the lobby erupted into chaos. Whispers exploded, reporters flooded the entrance within minutes, and my humiliation became headline news across the world. But what no one saw was what happened behind closed doors that night. When the adrenaline faded and the reality settled in, I sat alone in our penthouse, staring at my bruised wrist, replaying every word, every look, every shove over and over again, wondering how many women had stood where I stood without a billionaire husband walking through those doors. Adrian tried to comfort me, apologizing repeatedly, saying he had no idea his staff had become like this, but guilt sat heavy between us, because ignorance does not erase responsibility, and deep down we both knew the system he built had allowed this culture to grow. The next morning, my phone would not stop ringing. Media requests, survivor stories, employees from other hotels sharing similar experiences, cleaners, waitresses, travelers, students, all saying the same thing. They were judged by their clothes, their accent, their silence. And suddenly my pain had a voice louder than I ever imagined. Hashtags trended, videos hit millions of views, and while the world praised Adrian for his decisive action, they questioned why it took humiliation to expose cruelty. Sponsors demanded statements, investors panicked, employees feared retaliation, and the Grand Meridian became the center of a global conversation about class discrimination. That was when I realized something terrifying. Justice fueled by anger fades quickly, but justice built on dignity can last forever. So instead of hiding behind Adrian's name, I stepped forward publicly, not as a billionaire's wife, but as a woman who had been dragged across marble floors. And I said, this is not about revenge, this is about reform, and in that moment, the Dignity for All Foundation was born, a movement demanding mandatory empathy training, transparent complaint systems, and zero tolerance for appearance-based discrimination. And while many applauded, others resisted quietly, angry that someone like me dared to challenge luxury culture, and that resistance would soon reveal just how deep the rot truly went. As the foundation gained attention, I quickly learned that kindness threatens those who profit from cruelty. Anonymous emails began arriving accusing me of exaggeration, calling me an attention seeker, saying I should stay silent and enjoy my privilege. Hotel executives from competing chains smiled publicly while privately dismissing the initiative as unrealistic, claiming luxury required exclusivity and exclusion. And even within our own company, some senior staff pushed back, arguing that strict image standards protected brand value. But every argument collapsed the moment survivors spoke out, sharing footage, stories, bruises, tears, memories that mirrored mine so clearly it felt like reliving that day again and again. Adrien stood beside me, but this time he did not lead, he followed, because this fight was no longer about ownership, it was about humanity. We mandated retraining across all properties, partnered with advocacy groups, installed independent reporting systems, and made it clear that disrespect would cost more than profit. But transformation never comes quietly. Resignations followed, lawsuits were threatened, headlines shifted from praise to scrutiny, and I realized leadership meant standing firm when applause faded and criticism grew louder. And yet, through it all, messages kept pouring in from people saying thank you, saying for the first time someone like me spoke for someone like us. And those words carried me through the sleepless nights, the boardroom confrontations, and the fear that maybe I had started something too big to control, until the day I returned to the Grand Meridian, not as a surprise guest, not as a victim, but as a witness to change. You think the story ended with apologies and training sessions, but this is where truth gets uncomfortable. Smash the subscribe button right now, because what I witnessed when I walked back into that same hotel weeks later proved that change is not about words, it is about courage. And remember, this could happen to you because places don't change, people do, and sometimes they pretend to change just to survive. When I returned to the Grand Meridian, my heart raced harder than it did the first time, not because I feared humiliation, but because I feared disappointment. The glass doors opened again, the same marble floors, the same chandeliers, the same piano music, but something felt different. Staff stood straighter, eyes softer, smiles slower, more intentional. The new receptionist greeted me warmly, without scanning my clothes, without hesitation. She said, "Welcome to the Grand Meridian. How may I assist you?" And for the first time, those words felt real, not rehearsed. I watched closely as other guests entered, a man in worn shoes, a woman with a crying child, a delivery worker holding a box, and every single one of them was treated with the same respect, offered water, assistance, patience, and I wanted to believe this was genuine. But healing teaches you caution, so I walked deeper into the hotel, testing the culture quietly, observing interactions behind polished counters and curated smiles. Some employees embraced a change openly, sharing stories of training sessions where they were forced to confront their own biases. Others followed rules stiffly, kindness practiced, not yet internalized. And that was when I realized transformation is not instant, it is uncomfortable, slow, and often resisted in silence. Because later that day, an anonymous note appeared in my room, slid under the door with only 6 words written on it: "You ruined everything for us." And suddenly the weight of leadership pressed heavier than ever, because progress always creates enemies, and the people who benefited from cruelty do not surrender power easily. And as I stood alone holding that note, I knew the hardest part of this journey had just begun. I folded the note slowly, my hands steady, even though my chest felt tight, because fear only wins when it is allowed to speak louder than purpose. And that night, as I walked through the corridors, I realized how deeply power hides in silence. Staff lowered their voices, conversations stopped when I passed, and not all smiles reached the eyes. Yet the next morning, something unexpected happened. A young housekeeper approached me quietly, her hands trembling, as she said, "Thank you for seeing me." For the first time in 10 years, no one ever asked how guests spoke to us before. And then another employee joined, and another, sharing stories of insults, threats, and forced smiles swallowed with tears. And I understood then that resistance was loud, but gratitude was deeper. I met with teams openly answering hard questions, admitting Mistakes and promising protection, not perfection, and slowly walls cracked, not all at once, but enough to let light in. And when I finally stood in the lobby where I had once been dragged out, I watched a security guard kneel to speak gently to a scared child. A receptionist patiently helped an elderly man fill out a form, and for the first time since that day, my chest loosened, because healing does not erase pain, it gives it meaning. And as I left the hotel, I knew this story was no longer about what happened to me, it was about what would never happen again. Just when I thought we had survived the humiliation and the initial chaos of the viral videos, the real storm hit. The next week, the luxury hospitality industry turned against us quietly. At first, emails and calls filled with thinly veiled threats and veiled warnings that the foundation's policies would hurt business profits and reputation. Then came the open confrontations at the International Hotel Conference, where Adrienne and I attended to present the new standards for respectful treatment. Employees whispered anxiously in the background as I walked onto the stage, and I could feel the weight of thousands of eyes judging every move, every gesture. Some executives smirked, some rolled their eyes, some whispered behind hands, and as I began to speak, recounting the story of being dragged from the Grand Meridian, detailing the humiliation and the indifference, explaining how respect was not optional but a requirement for dignity, the room shifted uneasily. Some leaned forward, some crossed arms defensively, and I realized immediately that telling the truth was more threatening than any fabricated story. The opposition began subtly, at first challenging statistics, then questioning my motives, then outright claiming that enforcing respect would bankrupt hotels in smaller cities, that kindness could not be standardized, and worse yet, some board members from Adrienne's own company whispered doubts to him privately, trying to shake his resolve. But he did not flinch. He stood silently, eyes locked with mine, letting the truth speak for itself. And when a particularly arrogant executive tried to interrupt me, calling the foundation naive, I calmly recounted hundreds of anonymous stories from staff and guests whose voices had never been heard until now, and every anecdote landed like a hammer on the marble floor of their arrogance. I watched a security team I had once feared now smiling gently at staff and guests, seeing them interact. The training had taken root, some sincerely, some cautiously, but enough to show that behavior could change. And the whispers from staff about retaliation became stories of courage. Employees began to report abuses anonymously, proudly knowing the foundation and the hotel leadership would protect them. And as I concluded my speech, the room was silent. Not all converted, some still resisted quietly, but the message was unmistakable: dignity is not negotiable, and power cannot silence the voices of the oppressed. And in that moment I realized that the battle was never about appearances, it was about principle and courage. And while the road ahead would be long, with resistance still lurking in corners and media narratives spinning wildly, we had proven one undeniable truth: standing up for respect and humanity, even when everyone else doubts, you can change an entire culture one interaction at a time. And as Adrienne and I left the stage together, holding hands, I felt the weight of every injustice, every mockery, every shove in that lobby lift slightly, because we had turned humiliation into action and silence into a movement, and the storm that had threatened to break us had become the very force that strengthened our resolve to make dignity for all not just a promise but a standard. The days that followed the conference were some of the most challenging I had ever faced, because while the world cheered, behind the scenes resistance simmered, and every email, every phone call reminded us that change always has enemies, and not all who smiled in approval truly meant it. Some executives from other hotels began spreading rumors, painting the foundation as a publicity stunt, calling me a manipulator and Adrienne a man blinded by emotion, while internally certain senior staff tried to delay implementation, suggesting alternative, softer policies that would allow prejudice to continue under the guise of efficiency. And I realized in that moment that leadership is not about applause, it is about persistence, it is about walking through fire, knowing that criticism will not end. And so I held emergency meetings late into the night, discussing every complaint, analyzing every staff report, and reinforcing training protocols with an unwavering focus that left no room for ambiguity or error. Employees who had once been hesitant now came forward, proudly sharing observations, reporting small infractions, And slowly the culture began to shift from fear of punishment to pride in doing what was right, and on a personal level I discovered strength I never knew existed because facing public scrutiny, industry doubt, and whispers of betrayal tested my resolve in ways that humiliation alone had never done, and while Adrien remained my anchor, standing silently by my side as I navigated political minefields, boardroom tensions, and media manipulation, I realized the movement was bigger than both of us. It had a life of its own, and the moments that had once left me shaking with humiliation transformed into opportunities to teach, to advocate, and to prove that dignity was not dependent on wealth, appearance, or status. And as I walked the Grand Meridian, once again observing staff interacting with guests, seeing smiles that reached eyes, seeing gestures of genuine care that had once been absent, I felt the foundation of the movement solidifying like concrete, slowly but undeniably. And that night, as I looked out over the city from our penthouse window, I understood fully that the journey was far from over. The enemies were many, and the world would test us endlessly, but in every story of courage, every instance of respect restored, every employee who found their voice, we had already won a victory that could never be erased. And in that realization, I allowed myself a small smile, knowing that the Grand Meridian was no longer a place of humiliation, but a beacon for what was possible when dignity became non-negotiable. The moment I stepped into the Grand Meridian that morning, I could feel a weight of anticipation unlike anything I had ever experienced before. The lobby seemed brighter somehow, not because of light, but because of intention. Every staff member I passed held themselves differently. Their eyes were alive with recognition of their own responsibility, and I could see the transformation in the subtle gestures. A doorman held a child's hand with gentleness instead of impatience. A concierge went out of his way to listen carefully to an elderly guest asking about her preferences. A receptionist smiled warmly without scanning my outfit or questioning my presence, and I realized fully that the hotel had begun breathing a new air, one shaped by accountability, compassion, and deliberate care. And as I walked through the corridor leading to the new wing opening, I reflected on the journey that had brought me here. The initial humiliation when Jessica had sneered and the guards had grabbed me, the cold, calculated disdain in Patricia's eyes when she had ordered me removed, the fear, the whispers, the embarrassment, the viral videos that had shattered our world, and at the same time, the fire that had sparked within me, a fire that refused to let injustice remain unchallenged. A dignity for all foundation had taken root during sleepless nights and endless meetings where Adrien and I pored over reports, trained staff, set up independent reporting channels, handled media inquiries and boardroom skepticism, and every obstacle, every doubter, every critic had tested us relentlessly, because true transformation never comes without resistance. And I could feel that tension in the air. This day would show whether the foundation had truly worked, whether dignity had become standard practice or remained a fragile pretense. And as the crowd of guests, media, and staff gathered, I saw faces that had once sneered now watching respectfully, waiting for me to speak, and I realized fully that what had been personal humiliation had evolved into a movement with ripples far beyond the walls of this hotel. As I stepped onto the stage, the room fell silent, not because of fear or authority, but because of shared memory. Everyone present knew why we were here. They had seen the videos, read the headlines, followed the backlash, and now they were witnessing the outcome. And I began speaking not as a billionaire's wife, not as a founder, not as a symbol, but as a woman who had once been dragged across this very floor and left questioning her worth. I spoke about that day in detail, not to reopen wounds, but to remind everyone how easily power can blind, how quickly uniforms can forget humanity, and how dangerous silence becomes when cruelty is normalized. I spoke about the hundreds of messages from people across the world who shared stories of being judged, dismissed, or humiliated because of how they looked, how they spoke, or where they came from. And as I spoke, I watched faces soften. Some staff members wiped away tears, others nodded slowly, recognizing pieces of themselves in those stories. And I realized this was no longer a performance or a policy review. It was a collective reckoning. The foundation had grown beyond our expectations, partnering with hospitality schools, rewriting training curricula, influencing hiring practices, and even pushing governments in some regions to consider dignity-based service standards. And yet, despite all that progress, I admitted openly that the hardest part was not changing rules but changing hearts, because policies can be enforced but empathy must be chosen, and that choice has to be made every single day. In every single interaction, I acknowledged the mistakes we made along the way, the moments we underestimated resistance, the times we reacted emotionally instead of strategically, and the lessons learned through backlash and betrayal, because transparency builds trust more than perfection ever could. And as I looked out at the audience, I saw not enemies or critics but individuals capable of choosing better. And when Adrian joined me on stage, he did not speak as a billionaire or CEO. He spoke as a husband who had failed to see what was happening under his leadership, and who had learned that responsibility does not end at success, it begins there. And together we made a promise, not just to this hotel but to every person watching, that dignity would never again be treated as optional or conditional. And as applause filled the room, not loud and explosive but steady and sincere, I knew this was not the end of the journey, but the beginning of a new standard. And as the ceremony concluded and guests dispersed, I walked alone through the lobby, pausing at the exact spot where I had once been restrained, and I closed my eyes briefly, not to relive the pain but to acknowledge how far we had come. And in that quiet moment, I understood that justice does not erase the past, it reshapes the future and gives meaning to suffering by ensuring it is not repeated. I stayed there for a long moment, breathing in the sounds of the hotel, now different from before, not tense, not performative, but calm, purposeful. And when I opened my eyes, I noticed a young woman standing nearby, dressed simply, holding a small suitcase, her posture uncertain, the way mine had been that day weeks ago. And without thinking, I walked toward her and asked softly if she needed help. Her eyes widened, slightly surprised by kindness from someone she assumed was staff or management, and she nodded, saying she was nervous because she had never stayed in a place like this before and feared being judged. And in that instant, everything came full circle. I assured her she was welcome here, that this place was built for people, not appearances, and I personally escorted her to the desk where the receptionist greeted her warmly, explaining every detail with patience and respect. And as the woman walked away smiling with relief, I felt something inside me finally settle, because this was the real victory, not applause, not headlines, not foundations or speeches, but a single human moment where fear was replaced with dignity. And across the months that followed, stories like this multiplied, reports of discrimination dropped significantly, staff satisfaction increased, guest loyalty soared, and other hotel chains began quietly adopting similar standards, not because they were forced to, but because they saw that respect did not weaken luxury, it strengthened it. And the foundation expanded beyond hospitality into airlines, retail, hospitals, anywhere humans had been reduced to appearances and labels. And through it all, I never forgot that this movement was born from pain, from being laughed at, grabbed, and dismissed, and yet that pain had been transformed into purpose. And if there is one truth I want the world to remember, it is this: you never truly know who stands in front of you, but you always have a choice in how you treat them. Dignity costs nothing, but its absence costs everything. And today, when I walk through the Grand Meridian, not as a victim, not as a symbol, but simply as Camila Rodriguez, I no longer hear whispers or laughter. I hear kindness practiced deliberately and consistently. And that is how I know that the story that began with humiliation did not end in revenge, but in reform, and that the greatest power any person can hold is the power to treat another human being with respect. And even now, as time continues to move forward and the world finds new reasons to divide people by status, by wealth, by appearance, I carry that day with me, not as a scar but as a reminder that dignity is fragile and must be defended constantly, because systems do not become cruel overnight. They become cruel when good people stop paying attention. And I make it a point to walk unannounced into our hotels, to sit quietly in corners of lobbies, to listen to conversations, to watch how guests and staff are treated when no one thinks they are being observed. And every time I see patience where there was once impatience, compassion where there was once contempt, I am reminded that change is real but also reversible if vigilance fades. Adrien often asks me if I regret walking into the Grand Meridian that day dressed simply, and I always tell him no, because had I walked in wearing Diamonds and designer labels, none of this would have been revealed. The cruelty would have remained hidden, polished, and protected, and thousands of others would have continued to suffer silently. So if there is an ending to this story, it is not wrapped in perfection or applause, it is wrapped in responsibility, a responsibility we all share to treat the person in front of us as worthy regardless of what they wear, where they come from, or how much money they have, because you may never know whose life you